各位现场的贵宾，还有 YouTube 上关心艺术与环境永续的朋友们，大家好。我是杨金元，我在北艺大研究发展处服务。那同时，我有另外一个身份，就是在本校的剧场设计系担任专任副教授。那为了今天能够充分的传达我在过去准备这个论坛的过程所感受到的，请各位容许我等一下会念我的稿子，希望各位不会介意啊。好，我在剧场艺术的专长领域是技术设计与制作，在本校戏剧学院的年度公演，协助的是舞台设计老师跟导演，将他们的想象幻化成舞台上的布景、道具、机关。同时也带领着助教跟学生一起完成整个制作跟演出。那在过往的制作经验中，虽然我们有库存的景片、库存的平台，但是每次在拆台的时候，会感觉特别难受，也会觉得非常的惭愧，因为这些为了艺术的目的量身打造的舞台废弃物，将来不是送到垃圾掩埋场，就是垃圾焚化炉。那我们都会开始想一件事情，难道没有更文明的方式了吗？难道我们剧场人就可以这样滥用地球的资源吗？还有一个问题是，难道我们的温室气体还不够吗？虽然在我们做制作的过程会减少使用新的材料，也重复的使用旧的材料，稍微减少了一点点罪恶感，但是心里面还是觉得不够踏实，因为我们无法预测舞台设计或导演他们是否会同意以永续的概念来创作新的作品，也无法量化在不同的制作中对于新材料、旧材料还有回收材料的比例关系。直到前一阵子，这个受命为主持人，在预备的过程中，我发现原来我心里面这些长期以来的困惑，国外的先驱他们早就有一套方法，也思考行之有年。因此，我非常荣幸能够以主持人的角色来介绍今天这场论坛。前情提要：疫情肆虐，让美国的表演艺术遭受到严重的创伤，加上种族歧视、政治对立的社会动荡，让剧场人重新思考自己在永续议题上的责任。究竟是社会应该需要剧场多一点，还是剧场会需要社会多一点？在全球面对气候变迁、生存威胁的同时，也不断的发生战争、对抗，还有资源争夺的情况。剧场作品要怎么样回应这些现况？产业环境如何参与社会的议题，还有改善地球的环境？这是个问题。为了使众人开启对话、讨论并描绘剧场的未来，巴纳德学院戏剧系的老师跟剧场专业人士合写了《永续制作指南》。这个指南从实务经验出发，分析剧场制作各部门的永续问题与解决方案，也免费提供了气候行动及永续资源配套给表演艺术组织。同样位在纽约市的创意再利用中心，则是用艺术材料仓库为概念，收集各方捐赠的可重复利用材料，提供给非营利的文化艺术组织、公立学校还有城市机构免费使用。另外也设有教育中心，提供创意再利用的课程跟活动，甚至进到社区实地分享再利用的艺术，赋予这些废弃物起死回生的可能性。本论坛第一场邀请的讲者是美国纽约巴纳德学院的副教授、校园永续发展及气候行动的总监 Sandra Goldmark， 他同时也是哥伦比亚跨学科气候研究学院的资深助理院长。第二场呢，会邀请到纽约文化事务部艺术材料专案的执行总监 Sansone， 同时还有同部门的画廊总监兼教育总监 Cloud Kaiser， 分享美国在艺术创作面对永续问题的做法。 同时，我们也邀请到台湾表演艺术联盟理事长陈锦成老师，为台湾表演艺术领域的制作物与废弃物的相关议题，以永续的角度思考解决的方案。在同一时间，3位纽约的讲者跟现场的锦成老师会跟大家在视讯上进行研讨，所以 Slide 多用点。接下来就请欣赏 Sandra Goldmark 带来的讲题：气候变迁与表演艺术，地球上不思议的交集。
My name is Sandra Goldmark, and I'm honored to be speaking with you all today. I'm grateful to the Taipei National University for the Arts for generously inviting me to share a little bit of my world with you all. I'm on the set for Pirandello Project, a devised piece which opened just last night here in the Minor Latham Playhouse at Barnard College. This little world was inspired by the words of Luigi Pirandello and made real by the creative team, production team, and students at Barnard and Columbia. This production tells a story, in the words of director Alice Regan, about who we are and how we know for sure. This set, designed by Anna Driftmeyer, also tells another story about how we make theater and what that process can say about who we are and the world we want to live in. It's wonderful to see students and colleagues from Barnard and Columbia here in the live audience. It is delightful to think about the audience in Taiwan. We're recording this talk here tonight, and it will be shared at the first ever Conference on Sustainability for the Performing Arts in Taiwan, to be held in December at Taipei National University for the Arts. It's exciting to make this connection between audiences on opposite sides of our small planet, who are wrestling with similar questions and challenges. I'm here today myself with 2 questions. One, how can we as theater artists bring a responsiveness to and awareness of the climate crisis to our work on stage? Second, what can we as theater artists contribute to the broader challenge, the very global challenge happening offstage? These are big questions. If you're a lone, underpaid theater artist, it can feel impossible to change your practice, much less your whole industry. It can feel even more impossible when you think at the global scale, when we look at the many intersecting challenges of the climate crisis: emissions, waste, plastic pollution, drought, flooding, wildfires, migration, inequality. It can feel so nearly impossible that ultimately it becomes a challenge of the imagination. Can we envision a more sustainable and equitable performing arts world? What about the bigger world? Can we even imagine it, much less make it real? About 12 years ago, I was teaching design here at Barnard and designing for theaters around the country. I cared about the environment, theoretically at least, but there I was at home, clutching my yogurt cups and bringing my little canvas bag to the supermarket, while at work in the theater, I was creating thousands and thousands of pounds of scenery, show after show, season after season, that went right in the dumpster. It felt gross. I could imagine a future, a world where my work contributed to a more sustainable and equitable planet, but making it real felt impossible. I toyed with this solution, briefly, but instead I tried to do what I would have done if faced with any design challenge. I tried to imagine something and then build it, one small step at a time. First, I started changing my own design practices, pulling more from stock, buying more used goods, avoiding certain materials. And I started talking about it with my colleagues, especially my colleagues here at Barnard, production manager Michael Banta, technical director Greg Winkler, costume shop manager Cara Feely, props artisan Reese Rafi, and all of the faculty and staff here. We started talking about how to build sustainability and circularity into the way we made theater. More on this later. Then, slight left turn, I started a social enterprise repair shop, bringing backstage theater artists together to imagine and build a little piece of the circular economy offstage. Next, 3 colleagues and I created the Sustainable Production Toolkit, a free resource for performing arts organizations. Along the way, I was tapped to build Barnard College's first Office of Sustainability, and now I have also joined the Columbia University Climate School, a new interdisciplinary school for climate leaders. I never would have predicted it, clutching my yogurt cups, but that moment of clarity or contrariness, and where I stubbornly imagined something different, set in motion a whole chain reaction that changed my work in the world forever. To make those changes, I leaned on what I knew, creating worlds on stage. Because designing for the stage is all about imagining the impossible and then making it real. In the theater, we do this over and over again, show after show, usually on time and on budget. Eleanor Fuchs describes this process in Visit to a Small Planet. She calls her essay a template for the critical imagination. Fuchs invites us to think of the play as a small planet. She asks us to mold the play into a medium-sized ball. Set it before you in the middle distance and squint your eyes. Make the ball small enough that you can see the entire planet. Fuchs knows that by really first seeing what is there in the text, we can then begin to extrapolate, to build the 2-dimensional world on the page out into 3 dimensions. We ask questions of the play, we imagine the world, and then we make it real, with scenery, with costumes, with our bodies. That planet can be as small as 1 industry, 1 theater company, 1 show. Like this one. Let's follow Eleanor Fuchs' advice and ask some questions. Really look at the little world around us. This wall was built with 4 of our stock flats. It's covered, as you can see, maybe you can see, the textured treatment. The flats underneath are stock. They're very typical. They're framed with 1x3 pine and skinned with Luan. We don't use Luan anymore, or we try to avoid it, but these were made probably 10 years ago, so at least we're getting a lot of use out of them. The texture was an interesting challenge. When we first started really leaning into reuse, we thought, well, how do you apply a seamless texture coat on something that you want to use over and over again? We started experimenting with skinning an element like this with a muslin wraparound and then applying the texture to that, which works quite nicely. And it really limits the amount of new materials you would have to buy for an element like this. In this case, we got really lucky. These flats are covered with a banner from Barnard's commencement ceremony, and the texture's applied to that, so a double win there. The flats underneath, as I said, are in this case skinned with Luan, but we would also ideally prefer to use something like Revolution ply or just regular AC ply in a pinch. What else do we see here? This ornate metal railing back here was bought at a salvage shop in Brooklyn and applied to this custom-built wood and steel frame that was built mostly from scrap. This red curtain is from stock. This painted curtain is rented from not too far away, Bellport, Long Island. The paint, the black tough prime is low VOC, and the white on the floor and the walls is 0 VOC paint. We try to avoid skinning our decks. We use paint instead, but if we have to skin, we might use masonite rather than MDF. MDF tends to have formaldehyde-based glues. The main items that we had to purchase new for this show were about $300 in lumber for some of the framing and ladders, and $400 for the paint and the joint compound. These efforts added up. For this production, scenic materials were 67% from stock, and new only 33%. Costumes were 62% from stock or used, and 38% new. And props were 60% stock, 30% used, and only 10% new. Not bad. The question, though, is, do these efforts really add up in terms of the bigger planet outside these walls? In 2015, we did an analysis of one of our shows called Some Hero. As built, the show was 50% new materials, 50% used. That's the middle line. The emissions from props, sets, and costumes for that show were equivalent to the emissions from one American home for 6 months. If we had built Some Hero all new, that's the bottom line, it would have been more than double the emissions. If we had been able to build it all used, and the top line, it would have been less than half. Not bad. These impacts of circular design and production processes are equally significant when you scale way, way up. We are currently less than 10% circular on a global scale. That means that more than 90% of the resources and materials we extract from the earth go into landfill or are incinerated, often within a year. According to the World Resources Institute, if we can double that number, double circularity, that means moving from a linear system of take, make, waste to a circular one of careful material choices, reuse, repair, recycling, remanufacturing, reverse logistics, and smart design and policy to support all of that. If we can double that number, global greenhouse gas emissions could be reduced by 39% and our total material footprint by 28% by 2032. Not bad. So, circularity is a powerful tool, on stage and off. But how did we get to the point here at Barnard where we're able to use it intentionally and consistently? We didn't always work this way. We weren't trained to work this way at school. And largely speaking, our industry does not work this way. You might recall that moment of cognitive dissonance, clutching my yogurt cups, after which I started to change the way I designed and started talking with my colleagues. We realized early on that if we wanted to make changes in our department and make those changes stick, we couldn't depend on the occasional super green designer. We needed to build a system where every artist who walked through the door was able to work sustainably. It needed to become a habit of design and production for Barnard, our business as usual. The furniture designer Charles Eames said that design depends largely upon constraints. He knew that constraints, limits, can actually fuel a good design and make it stronger. Well, we're used to constraints in the theater. Budget, timeline, the size of the loading dock doors, a weirdly small proscenium, an absurdly large apron, bad sightlines from the balcony. Sound familiar, anyone? We work within constraints, within limits, all the time, and our designs sing for it. Right now, in most theater processes, there are no explicit constraints around social and environmental impact. If Luan made from virgin hardwood trees harvested in Southeast Asia is the cheapest and easiest way to skin a flat, then forest be damned. If we need 50 identical red t-shirts on stage for the big musical number, and the only way we can afford it is to go to the dollar store, who cares that the woman who sewed those shirts earned less than a living wage? It's art, right? Well, we weren't buying it anymore. How could we build social and environmental constraints into our business as usual? First, we looked to the budget. The budget is where, after all, we're used to checking ourselves and making sure that we keep within our limits. The first thing we did was split our material line into 2 columns. So instead of a designer walking in the door and getting, say, $5,000 in materials, that designer would receive $2,500 in new materials and $2,500 in used materials. Budget is a tool to reflect your priorities and to track them. Why not put sustainability into it? Second, we started measuring our progress. We could easily track the dollars we spent on new and used goods, but what about the dollars we didn't spend when we pulled items from stock? In order to accurately measure the amount of used goods on stage, we needed to compare apples to apples, i.e., we needed to have a dollar value for items we pulled from stock, which are usually treated as a zero-cost element. For stock scenery, this is fairly simple. The cost of each item is estimated as if we had built it new, and we keep track of those, and each of our stock items has a price associated with them, and we can put that in the budget. Props and costumes, it's a little more complicated given the diversity of items in our stock, even our relatively small stock. So for props and costumes, we took the entire amount of money spent purchasing or renting costumes, let's say, in a given year, and divided that by the total number of items purchased or rented. We then came up with an average dollar item per costume. In 2017, that was $27, and we did something similar for props. What we're doing is we're naming something, putting a value on something that's usually unseen and untracked. Reuse is an ancient practice in theater. We all do it. All we're doing is making it a priority and setting targets around it. I've talked a lot about reuse today because for the areas of sets, props, and costumes, it's one of the simplest and most effective tools you can use to reduce your impact. But we do sometimes have to source new goods, of course. For this, we've established some internal guidelines here at Barnard, like avoiding Luan or foam, shifting to greener products whenever possible, and when buying new, trying to buy things that will go back into our stock and be used for a long time. Material sourcing and reuse is a big way to have an impact on your practice. But there are a number of other strategies worth mentioning, not least of which is about how to make a change in your organization, in your collective habits. There was a time after we first started all of this that it started to seem silly to track all this stuff. It was just us, after all. We're a small department. And who needs more paperwork in tech, really? It was easy to drop the habit, to slip. To keep ourselves honest, we started sharing our commitments and progress publicly in our program and on our website. Created some internal accountability and somehow made it seem official. We even eventually included sustainability as part of our departmental mission statement. We started out trying to avoid filling so many dumpsters. We wound up influencing the whole mission of the department. Not bad. Of all these small steps, one of the most important things we did was realize that we needed to communicate these goals, these limits, with all our designers and directors and artists ahead of time, especially the freelancers who work with us. People are busy, they go from show to show, and there are unspoken habits and norms across the industry, most of which are pushing us to work ever faster and cheaper. If we wanted to change those norms, we needed to be clear about it and support our guest artists in meeting those goals, just like we'd support them in meeting any of their other design goals. When Anna Driftmeyer walked in the door, she knew that sustainability and circularity were part of the limits of the job, just like the size of the loading dock door or the budget. She was game and really went the extra mile, but even if she hadn't been, we tried to build a system that would help her, or even someone less awesome, design a sustainable set. We didn't just expect Anna to do this on her own, or Greg, or Reese. We learned early on that if you think just one member of the team, the set designer or the prop person or the TD, should just take care of the sustainability, it doesn't work. A prop person might try really hard to avoid ordering items on Amazon, but if the director isn't on board and doesn't understand why they can't have that rubber chicken in rehearsal tomorrow, it puts the prop person in an impossible situation. Constraints need to be shared and owned by the whole team. It's not always so easy. I remember once, one of the first times I was trying to design a sustainable set, the director said to me, you know, I'm all for the environment, theoretically at least, but I'm really worried, is this going to compromise my show? He wasn't a jerk. He was being honest. Aren't many of us worried about what we might be giving up? Haven't the commitments in theory far outpaced the commitments in reality? That director and I sat down and we talked through the ways that working within social and environmental limits, just the way we work with a budget or a schedule, might actually enrich our show and make it stronger. We went on to design a production that won several awards. More importantly, we engaged the entire shop and producing company in the process. We moved money from our material line to our labor line, spending our money in a way that was in line with our values. finding ways to work creatively within those limits yielded a more collaborative and inclusive process and better results. But what if you're not the director or the producing organization like Barnard? How can you make change as a freelancer, a technician, the person who makes those little tape outlines on the prop table? It starts with opening the conversation while being sensitive to the realities of the world we work in. This is a survey that we did to identify common pain points in one theater company here in the US. I don't think you can read these, so I'll read them for you, and let me know if you can spot the common theme. We have general work-life problems, reliance on intern labor, expectations exceed available resources, underfunding and limited budgets, turnover of staff, overworked, exhausted, burnout, understaffed, underpaid, lack of wage equity, overcommitted, not enough time. It can feel impossible to make changes in the way we work when we're faced with burnout and exhaustion like we see here. Sustainability is not just about the environment. It's about equity and justice and people. Suzanne Mosher wrote, "Burnt out people aren't equipped to serve a burning planet." Here's something interesting we encountered when we started changing our practices here at Barnard. Prioritizing reuse changed the way we spent our money. We spent less on new materials, less on dumpsters, but sometimes found we needed to spend more on labor. Someone to source those used garments, someone to drive around the city finding the pallets or take them apart. But in a world of overwork and underpay, isn't spending money on people, not stuff, a good thing? Since 2016, the department has raised design fees by 58%, and prop artisan compensation by about 70%. Reallocation of materials budgets constituted 60% of that increase. We started working on waste and wound up working on wage equity. We can prioritize spending money on artist fees, not new items. We can prioritize spending money on local small businesses or BIPOC vendors. We can create a storage space to support circular practices and spend the money we used to spend on single-use sets on a person to maintain that stock. We can spend money in a way that aligns with our values and supports an equitable and sustainable future on stage and off. It actually doesn't require changing everything we do all at once. When we make a play, we imagine impossible worlds and then make them real on stage, question by question, step by step. And we can change the world of theater, question by question, step by step. But is changing the way we work here on this little stage the end? Is that all we can do? Should do? Because let's face it, we are tasked with much more than cleaning up the performing arts. We've got a big, small planet to imagine. We've got a lot of impossible ideas to make real. And one of the biggest constraints we face is time. So, as we hold our small, fragile planet in our mind's eye with one eye on the curtain time, what do we as artists have to offer? How can we bring the skills and practices we use on stage and backstage and join our colleagues in climate science, climate activism, climate justice, policy, to reimagine our world? As I mentioned, I recently joined the Columbia Climate School, and I also spent the past 5 years building the sustainability program here at Barnard. What that really means is that suddenly I was working outside the theater with all kinds of people and fields that were totally new to me. Emissions, LEED certification, ice sheets, change management. What does a theatrical set designer have to say to any of these people? I kept experiencing, weirdly, as I was talking with my new colleagues, this kind of déjà vu. And someone who couldn't be further removed from the theater, an energy consultant, a paleoclimatologist, a regenerative farmer, would tell me about their work, their challenges. I would recognize it. I would see all these little bits and pieces of what we do here in the theater, of what I did for so many years. Sometimes I would see a gap, a place where someone was struggling with something, and I would think, wait, We know how to do that. We do that all the time in the theater. Last week, I was talking with a colleague from the climate school, Richard Seeger. Richard is a climate modeler who works on atmosphere-ocean interaction. He told me a story about the development of the Norwegian cyclone model by Jacob Bjerknes and his colleagues in the years during and after World War I. This audience might well ask, as I did, what is a Norwegian cyclone model? Bjerknes and his team were studying storms. As Richard explained, they were able to collect extensive surface observations of pressure, temperature, precipitation, cloud cover, and humidity. Not my words, you can tell. But they did not have any measurements above the ground. This was around 1918, remember? Nonetheless, they extrapolated from their limited data on the two-dimensional field an image of a three-dimensional cyclone in order to create meteorological forecasts. Just as Eleanor Fuchs advised, again, here's Richard's words, through a combination of rigorous analysis and extreme creativity, they were able to imagine a phenomenon that could not be seen in its entirety in order to tell a story about the future. Listening to Richard, I recognized this process. It's the work of a designer, a director, who takes whatever facts or data points exist in a script, a two-dimensional page, and through a similar blend of rigorous analysis and extreme creativity, create something three-dimensional that can speak for itself. Like Norwegian meteorologists, in theater, we do this collaboratively, knowing that every person on the show matters, from the playwright to the person who puts the little tape outlines on the prop table. And we work within constraints, accepting that limits, whether the budget for a set or the carrying capacity of a natural resource, will ultimately fuel our work and make it stronger. These skills are not trifling. This is what the theater demands of us. But it's also what the world demands in the face of climate change. Aviana Rodriguez wrote, "The old myths will die when we can replace them with new ones. We need our storytellers, a mighty force, to help us shift our mythology and imagine a new future where together we thrive with nature." Whether you are creating a set for a play or a meteorological forecast or beautiful little tape outlines on a prop table, you are telling a story about who we are and the world we want to live in. You are that mighty force. So hold that small, fragile planet in your mind's eye, squinting as you imagine that impossible world, and then make it real. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Tara Sansone. I'm the Executive Director of the Arts Space in Queens, New York.
Hello. Hi.
And I'm here.
I think we are not at that stage yet, so please just wait. Give me 1 minute. Okay. Hi. It's John and Sarah. Nice to meet you. Okay. So 我刚刚这个演说是来自于一个舞台设计师哦。那我每一次听一次，感动一次。他刚刚特别提到的一个重要的事情是，钱不一定要花在我们的材料、花在我们的物品上面，钱是可以投资在人的身上。哦，这件事情非常重要。所以各位想要加薪的北医大的员工，你们有福了，机会来了。我们的大家长刚好坐在下面，他应该听到了刚刚这段很棒的演说。那我稍微讲一下刚刚我对 Sandra 里面一个非常特别有感触的话哦。他提到他第一次跟一个剧场导演第一次要做永续布景的时候，他说到，我们其实时间有限制，预算、材料、人员的技术能力各方面都有限制，甚至连我们的剧场的卸货口 连货梯都有限制。那为什么我们不能把减量、回收、再利用这样的观念、这样的永续限制的概念，把它当作我们的限制之一呢？我想这是一个非常好的一个观念。那我们现在现场呢，因为我们的另外2位朋友呢也到了这里啊。Hello, so I think you are waiting. So
2位是不是等很久了？我接下来会用中文介绍2位。
用热烈的掌声啊，因为他们已经在线上等了。欢迎来自纽约的 Sansone 跟 Cloud Kaiser 带来本论坛的第2个主题：纽约市最大的创意材料回收再利用中心。
非常谢谢北艺大的盛情邀请，让我们能够参加今天的这个论坛。那我们来自纽约市。那这个第1页呢，就是可以看到我们的这个 logo， 还有我们的仓库。我们请到简报下一张，谢谢。那我们的这个创意材料回收再利用中心 NFTA 已经44岁了。我们有非常多的合作伙伴，包含我们是一个会员制，那有非常多的教育及非营利伙伴。那目前呢，跟这个我们的合作伙伴 Friends of Materials for the Arts 在纽约市的长岛市呢，有35000平方英尺的这个再利用中心。那我们的卸货口呢，可以开放接受这个捐赠的材料。那每个礼拜我们会有2次可以开放我们的会员呢，来免费使用这个回收材料。大家听得清楚我说话吗？
Is it possible to reduce the echo?
音讯好像不是很好。电脑音讯这边可不可以设定一下？因为回音蛮大的。是不是可以请您戴这个耳机，然后减少电脑这边的这个回音呢？不知道Tara 这边有没有耳机或者是 AirPod？好，我去拿一下我的这个手机。那John 这边是没问题的。大家好，真的非常开心能够参加今天的论坛哦，也很开心能跟大家分享。那也很开心听到说 Sandra 刚刚精彩的分享，那也很开心看到大家这么努力的在推动艺术来落实永续。那今天我跟 Tara 其实就是想要分享，在纽约市我们这个艺术材料回收的这个计划。那它在纽约市其实从1967年到今天。那可以看到说，我们的仓库也都一直在运作哦。其实仓储空间非常的大，那但是它毕竟就是一个仓库，它也没有什么很厉害的这个 排列。那它就在纽约市，你可以看到说，就像一个商店一样，大家可以推着这个购物车，然后去选你要的东西。只是说，所有的这个物品都是捐赠的，都是由例如说艺文机构或者说剧院，他们想要减少浪费，或者说希望能够让这些剩余的物品回收再利用。所以可能是剧院把他们剩下不要的东西捐赠，或者说重新再利用的物品。所以这个是非常好的一个计划，不只是环保爱地球，那也能够为这个艺术家剧院省下几百万元的这个费用啊。我们到下一页，谢谢。这个是我们所在的位置。这边要跟各位特别分享的就是我们就在纽约市中心。那其实在市中心这个位置非常的重要，因为大家今天有需要的时候，你可能需要这个交通工具嘛。那当我们今天离市中心越远，可能开车的里程越长，运输越长，但是我们就是希望减少碳排嘛，所以如果能够位在市中心，就能减少运输的这个里程，减少交通的使用量，也能让我们的材料更能够广为大家应用。等于说在市中心大家来的距离都比较短一点。这边也可以看到，我们其实也是纽约市文化局的一个这个专案。那在这种机制下，其实我们也能够为纽约市府呢省下非常多的钱，在艺术这部分有所节省。那我们就在一栋大楼的3楼。纽约市不是这个建筑的所有人，但是透过这个专案，我们能够省下非常多的费用。这样子有比较好吗？大家听得到？好，谢谢。刚刚有谈到说，我们是35000平方英尺的这个空间，那25000英尺是这个仓储空间，然后另外一个卸货口也有2部电梯。那有10000平方英尺是就是教室，那我们尽量把这个空间做最大化的利用。在入口的部分，它就是一个画廊。所以刚刚说仓储大概就是20000平方英尺，那每一列呢都是不同的物品，可能是布料啦，可能是办公的这个家具啊，可能是这个艺术品，或者说碗盘瓢盆啊等等的，或者说来自就是影视使用的这个物品等等。所以大家可以从入口就会看到画廊，然后看到说我们的这个驻村艺术家的作品，了解说这些艺术家的故事，然后可以拿一台这个推车啊，然后就看他们需要什么东西，那之后就从出口然后去搭电梯离开这样子。另外也有这个艺文工作室，还有我们的置放空间，就是如果说大量捐赠的时候，可以做暂时储存。好，下一张，谢谢。那有的人会想说，这个到底创意材料回收再利用中心是怎么诞生的？也希望说，全世界也许都可以有这样的地方。我们其实也常跟全球各地的单位来分享，提供他们一些建议，怎么样成立这样的一个像 MFTA 的中心。那我们常说，其实就是从永续的概念开始。那并不是每一个城市的经济状况，整个这个社区组成都一样，大家的情况都不一样，所以你要有这样的永续计划其实每个城市的做法都不一样。你可以透过这个反向工程的方式去推。我们也可以跟各位分享在1970年代 在纽约呢，有一位艺术家，他其实是在动物园工作。那动物园就需要一个这个冰箱来放这个动物奶，就是给出生的动物小 baby 喝的奶。那他就开始发信啊，就是问说，有没有人要捐冰箱？结果呢，他收到了上百封的回信，上百台的这个冰箱。他发现说，就是这个动物园也发现说，竟然有这个方法。那这位艺术家也刚好是纽约人。那艺术对纽约来讲是一个核心的元素。那纽约市文化局呢，就发起了这个计划。一开始只是一个很小规模的专案，但是呢，规模就快速的扩大，因为真的是发现说，哇，有非常多的没有要用的二手物品，或者说用过的不要的物品。之后呢，就从本来是一座动物园的这个仓库，然后变成一栋大楼的某个仓库，然后建筑大楼又越换越大，到现在我们有三楼，然后一个非常大的这个仓库。它就是一个自然演变的过程哦。这些材料来了，有人要就给他们，然后需求越来越多，捐赠的量也越来越大。那这是一个正向的循环了，不断的发酵。那我们非常自豪的，就是说，其实这个也是纽约艺术风景的一环，不只是艺术家，整个艺术社群其实就像是这个领先者引领这样的永续风潮，这种回收材料的风潮。那女性也扮演要角哦。有很多人想要在纽约，例如说推动社会平等，推动社会正义。那其实这些也都能够牵到永续这件事。那现在其实 MFTA 已经成为不可挡的一股势力哦。我们也持续在帮助大家回收啊，然后接收物品。
请播下一张投影片。我想要用这个机会跟大家分享一下，这是我们仓库的照片，里面放满了很多布料，还有各式各样的素材。我想稍微介绍一下我们的捐赠人，而且我们的这些年来捐赠人越来越多。我们的捐赠人有企业、法人、大小的企业，还有个人都有，还有来自艺术家。刚才 John 也提到MFTA 是来的是真的是艺术家真的在用的这些素材，像是彩色笔、胶水、蜡笔，还有油漆，舞者又穿的鞋，景片，就是这些剧场在做布景时候用到的景片，还有很多很漂亮的布料，他们用来做布幕的各种各样的布料。这些素材来到我们这边，就避免了被丢弃的命运，所以我们又可以把这些很有用、很漂亮的这些素材，可以免费提供给我们的会员使用。我们有很多像这样的艺术机构在纽约有非常多，所以我们累积到很多的素材。是我还有回声吗？因为我们可以收集到大量的素材，来了以后，其实很快就被借出去了。我给大家看一下，我们会员来这边选购材料的时候，比如说在 Harlem 有一个小的剧团，他们要准备一部戏，或者是大型的公立剧场，他们要做一个大制作。有时候来的人是老师，那他们在教室里面要做一些跟艺术相关的课程，或者是舞者、 视觉艺术家、表演艺术家、城市的各种中介机构，还有社会工作者。因为我们有大量的素材，那这些大量的素材就避免了丢弃到掩埋区。那我们可以在有需要的人，比如说在这些避难所的孩子，所以社会工作者也可以把我们这些艺术素材带给这些小朋友。那我们有时候收到一些会大型的捐赠品，是一些当代的这些布景，所以我们成立了一个平台。比如说，有一些捐赠人要捐很大型的，比如说大型的这些布景，像 Burberry， 他们用到的布景都非常大。有时候有一次，他们送了2个卡车的高9英尺的非常大型的这个很重的布景，我们收集了以后，我的投影片好像里面有一张是他们送来的时候的照片。我们最后把这些布景放到一个永续时装展的布景了，所以有一些是送去动物园里面作为他们的装置艺术。所以我们希望把这些素材提供给各个产业，包含时尚产业。那他们把这些素材捐赠给我们，而不是丢弃，因为他们也觉得这样比较不会浪费钱。这样可以让这些素材再次的使用，重获新生。我们来看第7张投影片 ，John 交给你好吗？我想我们想要强调的是，有时候这样的计划运作起来好像很复杂，但是其实我们就像刚才 Sandra 提到的一个小小星球的概念，其实都很简单，有很多素材是可以重新使用，而且可以帮我们的城市省下几百万美元。每年我们有超过4000个会员组织来我们这里寻找素材，我们免费提供素材。虽然我们的运作成本很少，但我们回馈城市的如果计算下来的话，大概有几百万美元哦。我们提供给公立学校为他们的艺术计划提供素材，还有另外为其他的艺术制作提供价值600万美元的素材。另外还有这些公司因为他捐赠了素材给我们，所以他们对自己的客户也可以宣导说我们有为社会贡献。所以像这些其实都是连锁效应的，就是很自然而然的从一个地方然后捐赠到另外一个地方去。这只很大的长颈鹿就是 Burberry 的旗舰店里面本来他们的一个装置，本来是要丢掉的，后来他们送过来，另外还有其他的素材，我们把这些素材出借给我们的会员。我想要稍微介绍一下我们的计划。John 是教育总监，另外我们之所以可以存在，是因为得到了市政府的支持。我们是市政府旗下的一个专案，所以市政府非常重视，让我们有很多的资源，给了我们一个这么大的空间，是专门给艺术还有文化 的组织使用的。另外，我们也有非盈利的伙伴，帮我们支付其他的支出费用。因为他们，我们可以做一些计划，比如说我们的教育计划，还有一个